South Africa is the only country, I beg your pardon, on the continent to have cracked an invite to this year's G7 summit. The three-day summit kicks off today in the coastal British town of Carrots Bay. That's a popular tourist destination. So as its rotational president, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is hoping to unite the group of 7 countries under the Build Back Better slogan. Climate change, the economy, the coronavirus pandemic, as well as geopolitics are all expected to top the agenda. Together with leaders of Italy, France, Germany, Canada, Japan and the United States, Johnson is hoping that decisive action on challenges facing the planet will be taken. As Africa's only representative among the world's most advanced economies, President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to advance Africa's concerns about a just transition to greener energy. Chief Executive at the South African Institute for International Affairs, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, joins us now via our video link for some kind of analysis. Elizabeth, great to see you. Thanks for making time to chat to us as always. I wonder if we can start with the President and how on earth he's going to try spin a good story if in fact we believe that will be his intention. He leaves behind, in South Africa's context, a nation with unreliable energy supply, a lagging vaccine rollout, and some key hospitals in the country's economic hub without water. Where does he begin?
Well, good morning, Ayanda, and thanks for inviting me. Firstly, I think it's important to note that South Africa is there as a guest. Of course, in the run-up to the G7 summit, a number of the government senior officials have been participating in the meetings on, as you've outlined already, on discussions around the vaccine, on the green transition, on open societies, which is another topic that is on the agenda under the UK presidency. And the idea has been to bring in these 4 guests. There are in fact 4 guests, that's South Africa, India, South Korea and Australia, into some of these discussions. They are guests, so they're not necessarily in all of them, and they don't necessarily they're not necessarily they haven't been in part of the crafting of the communiques. But clearly South Africa has put across a number of its issues in the opportunities that it has had as a guest about the concerns, its own concerns. One of the biggest, well, 2 of the biggest, I suppose, is on the one hand, the issue of vaccines and vaccine justice and vaccine apartheid. In that context, of course, it's the South African position at the WTO and the waiver, which with the exception of President Biden, who has indicated he's willing to have, that the US is willing to have that conversation, the other G7 countries have been much less willing to go down that road. They have suggested other alternatives for dealing with some of the vaccine challenges. The other one, of course, is the issue of the green transition. And for South Africa, yes, energy poor at the moment. We're all living through that. But that is one of the biggest challenges that I think we have to become much more coordinated as a society, as South Africa incorporated, in terms of the points that we put on the agenda of the international fora like the G7.
Right.
Climate finance is critical in that regard, and how we manage our transition in a socially just but also economically a sort of strategic way. And some of these hopefully have been filtered into the conversations that they've had both in the running up to the G7 summit and now at the summit today and tomorrow.
We'll speak about placing the G7 summit and its importance in an increasingly globalized community. Let's hone in on the role that Trump plays first. It's his first trip outside of the United States since being President. Biden, I beg your pardon. That's right. It's Biden's first trip outside the United States. I'm thinking about Trump because it's also the first time that these 7 leaders or the leaders of these countries meet without what is called the Trump effect. You know, this kind of spontaneous, off-the-script type diplomacy. How does the United States convince the world that they are again committed to diplomacy, given the past 4 years they've had?
That's a very good question, and I think many of us will remember that picture of one of the G7 summits. I think it was in Canada, where everybody is around him trying to convince him, Donald Trump that is, about a particular issue. And I think the previous G7 communiques were highlighted by we all agree except for the US. I think that's been one of Biden's big sort of big objectives since coming to office in January, is really to convince the world through multiple actions of the fact that the U.S. is back in both multilaterally and more broadly in the foreign policy realm, that it is about working together with particularly its partners, and the G7, the rest of the G7 are among its most important partners, both economically and geopolitically. We've seen it in the way in which they have engaged, whether we agree with the route they have taken, on some of these, but the way in which they've engaged in multilateral institutions, and certainly in the way that the U.S. has reached out to its traditional partners, and I would argue also to partners outside that sort of North Atlantic sphere. It is something that they're going to have to constantly be working at. It's about rebuilding trust. And I think the world will never be, and the way in which other countries respond to the U.S. will, the last 4 years have made most countries really rethink the fact that they cannot necessarily put all their eggs in one basket in terms of alliances, if you're talking about both the Europeans as well as, for example, the East Asians. But I think there has been a real effort, and we'll see some of that also in the statements around the WTO waiver and the agreement on global tax, that the U.S. is here to play more ball with the other partners rather than playing a game on its own on a different field.
Absolutely. There's also the saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Quite literally, President Cyril Ramaphosa will be having lunches with these presidents. What is at stake for South Africa, given our positionality against a summit like the G7 summit? In other words, what does the G7 summit have to gain from South Africa being there as a guest?
It's interesting that they've invited these 4 countries, and we remember an earlier time 20 or so years ago when President Mbeki used to be a permanent invitee, virtually almost, to the G7 summit, and was where he rolled out his new Partnership for Africa's Development, that came under another name at the time. So his whole African Renaissance idea, where we put across our commitments as Africa and required support from the G7. The world has changed very much since the very dominant role that the G7 had 20 years ago. And that's really the G20. 2008, the global financial crisis. The G20 now has become the sort of the premier global economic governance forum. But the G7 clearly has a lot of heft and a lot of weight. They are among the biggest economies in the world. From a development aid perspective, they're also very important. They're also very important in determining some of the rules and decisions and standards that one finds, in various multilateral bodies and plurilateral agreements, sort of smaller global agreements. If you just think of IMF rules, World Bank rules, the issue around special drawing rights, SDRs, that has been part of the discussion to help developing economies pay for vaccines or access vaccines. All of these are important countries, which is why I think it's a recognition of South Africa's leadership role on the continent, and South Africa is using that both for its own, to put across on a one-on-one or a tete-a-tete basis with these seven leaders all in one room, some of its most important concerns around green finance, around vaccines and vaccine access, issue of patents and intellectual property rights. Nothing may necessarily come out of it in the sense of, we're going to tick all the boxes that we wanted to achieve. But the opportunity to engage with them, I think, is very important. And we should see this as a longer game. So we are here now at the G7 summit, but many of these discussions are also going to be moved into the G20 platforms, and they are, in fact, in some instances being discussed in parallel. There is a meeting at the end of this month, a finance ministers meeting on the issue of global taxation, which is also something that's important for South Africa. So this should be seen as part of a process where South Africa must constantly engage in a variety of forums and build alliances with like-minded countries, particularly, for example, developing countries who are coal dependent. We can't just transition. there has to be a process and there has to be some financing, and we need to think about how we take that and advance that in global forums. And certainly going into next year when the G7 is also chaired by Germany. These are all important actors, but
Right.
they're not the only actors.
Fascinating discussion. Elizabeth, always great chatting to you. Thanks so much for making time for us. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos is the Chief Executive of the South African Institute for International Affairs. Once again, thanks very much indeed.